Hi, it's Katrina. My friend David is going to be helping me out with the voiceover today, so everyone give him a warm welcome.
Number 10. Maximilien Robespierre. Maximilien Robespierre was born on May 6, 1758. He would grow up to be the leader of the French Revolution, and while he was invested in creating a new nation that relied on the virtues of liberty and equality for all, he went about it in a questionable way. He was the one behind what's called the Reign of Terror. His ideals may have been admirable, but he went through extreme actions that resulted in bloodshed and horror, the likes of which hadn't been seen in France in a very long time. Maximilien started out as a lawyer. He supported political campaigns, fought against slavery, and opposed the royal family. He was a philosopher, he opposed the death penalty, and he didn't believe in cruel and unusual punishment. By the year 1789, Maximilien was the leader of the political faction known as the Jacobin Club. Then in 1792, the people of France, with Maximilien's help, rose up against King Louis XVI. King Louis was killed by the guillotine on January 21, 1793. And with this little taste of blood, Maximilien went crazy. He went on a spree of violence and executions, and on September 5th of that same year, the Reign of Terror began. Maximilien was, for all intents and purposes, leading the country of France. He determined that the only way for the revolution to continue and for himself to remain in power was to put to death every single opposing political group. Roughly 16,000 people were killed by guillotine, with nobody knowing how many more were killed in other ways. Maximilien was so drunk on bloodlust, his own people ambushed and executed him on July 28, 1794. Number 9. Bloody Mary. The legend of Bloody Mary goes back to Queen Mary I. She was the first woman to rule England by herself and who didn't inherit the throne. She seized it with powerful ambition in 1553. At the time, the public was thrilled. It was said that nobody could remember a time when the public rejoiced so much at seeing a new ruler. Mary Tudor was widely celebrated, yet before long she became one of the most despised figures in English history. She was the eldest daughter of Henry VIII. To understand how she became so evil, we need to look at what Henry did during his rule. He cut ties with the Roman Catholic Church and created the Church of England. But after his death, when Mary took over, she switched the country back to being Roman Catholic. But this didn't sit well with the people of England, who had already gotten used to their new church. Mary didn't care, and she started sentencing people to death. Anyone who stood between her and the reinstitution of Roman Catholicism was met with heavy-handed violence. During her short reign, between 1553 and her natural death 5 years later in 1558, she officially had 280 Protestant people burned at the stake. Mary didn't just execute religious dissidents, she burned them alive. Number 8. The Mad King Nebuchadnezzar. In the Hebrew Bible, known more commonly as the Old Testament, one of the greatest villains is Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II. The Old Testament claims Nebuchadnezzar laid siege to Jerusalem, looted all the gold and treasure he could get his hands on, abducted the Judean king, then stole all the artisans and skilled workers, and took them back to Babylon. 10 years later, after he had already decimated the Judeans, he returned to Jerusalem and burned Solomon's temple to the ground. The book also says the king was punished for his barbarity by being turned into a crazy person. He went mad, wandered into the wilderness, and then roamed like a lost beast and ate nothing but grass. How much of this is accurate has been a raging debate for centuries. History tells us Nebuchadnezzar II was a real king who ruled the Babylonian Empire at the peak of their power between 605 and 562 BC. He was a great builder who elevated Babylon to become one of the greatest cities the world has ever seen. We know this because of hundreds and hundreds of inscriptions found by archaeologists. As for the conquest of Jerusalem, that's also been documented. The exact date was 597 BC, when the king of Babylon brought his armies against the city of Judah and captured the king. And he did it all because the Judean king, Jehoiakim at the time, refused to pay tribute. Since the Judeans wouldn't pay money to the great king, he utterly decimated their city, slaughtered their people, and stole their gold. Number 7. Pedro the Cruel. Pedro the Cruel was the son of Alfonso XI, King of Castile. When Pedro was just a boy, Alfonso abandoned his mother, Maria of Portugal, and shacked up with his mistress. Pedro and his mom were shipped far away from the royal court, and the king went on to have 10 children with his mistress. It wasn't until the year 1350, when Pedro was 16, that he was finally brought to court. His father died from the Black Plague, and even though he had nearly a dozen illegitimate children, Pedro was still the heir to the throne. One of Pedro's first actions was to kill the mistress. His father's mistress was butchered, along with anyone who supported his half-brothers. According to historian L.J. Andrew Vialon, Pedro was vindictive from the start. After the first few ordered executions, he really got a taste for it. Pedro married Blanche of Bourbon, the daughter of a very powerful duke. It was the perfect marriage to secure alliances with the French, but just like his father before him, Pedro ditched his new wife for his mistress, Maria de Padilla. Pedro went even further, having his new wife murdered in 1361 after he collected the dowry from the marriage. Pedro's irrational behavior continued until he was considered a burden to everyone and had alienated himself from every nation. In 1369, he got into a fight with his half-brother Enrique and died from a sword in his stomach. He was hated so much that after his death, his body was left out to be abused by his people. Number 6. Emperor Aurangzeb. Aurangzeb was the last effective emperor of the Mughal Empire. He ruled India from between 1658 and 1707. His reign started after he imprisoned his father and murdered his brother. Those are pretty evil things to do, but in all fairness, they weren't all that uncommon when an ambitious young man had a father and brother between him and the throne. Aurangzeb came from a long line of beloved rulers. His great-grandfather Akbar was celebrated by all his people. His grandfather Jahangir was famous for his love of art and admiration of architecture, and the father whom he killed, Shah Jahan, was the genius and romantic who was behind the construction of the Taj Mahal. Aurangzeb was a disappointment to them all, and the worst in his family line. He quickly grew to be a ruthless tyrant who wished to expand his empire by any means necessary. He imposed Sharia law, which was extremely unpopular. Then he taxed people of the Hindu faith, and if they didn't pay their taxes, they could be beaten or killed. Aurangzeb was also just generally awful. He reportedly hated music, he didn't like art, and architecture bugged him so badly, he ordered the destruction of ancient temples. Number 5. Queen Fredegund. Queen Fredegund was the royal consort of Chilperic I, who was the Frankish king of Soissons in the 6th century. She started her life out with very little power, but quickly climbed the political ranks thanks to befriending King Chilperic. She started as his first wife's servant, but managed to seduce the king and persuade him to divorce his wife and send her into isolation at a convent. Fredegund literally boosted herself from a servant to a queen consort while having the original queen banished. But her dreams fell apart fairly quickly when the king got bored and married somebody else. Within the same year, the new queen was discovered strangled. It's believed Fredegund either did the strangling herself or ordered someone else to do it. Whatever the case, she was the next to be queen. In 584, Chilperic I died. Fredegund was left in control of the kingdom. She was an extremely effective ruler. When the Franks went to war with Burgundy, she took on the role of commander and led the armies herself. But she was also fairly evil. She was responsible for multiple assassination plots on almost everyone. She's been described as a queen obsessed with assassination. She hunted clergy, political figures, and even King Guntram of Burgundy. She was so murderous that at one point Fredegund took up residence in the Notre Dame Cathedral because it was considered a sanctuary where she herself couldn't be assassinated. Number 4. Cambyses II. Cambyses II was not quite as revered as Cambyses I, also known as Cyrus the Great. Cambyses II was Cyrus the Great's son and a man of infinite cruelty. He began to co-rule the Persians alongside his father in the year 530 BC, but after his father died during an expedition against the Masagetai, Cambyses II was left in control of the entire kingdom. He was the only ruler of the Achaemenid Empire, which his father had elevated from a vague tribe to a world power. Cambyses II began his conquests immediately. He fought wars in North Africa, conquered Egypt, defeated Pharaoh Psamtik III, and died a massive failure. While he was busy conquering foreign lands, Persia was thrown into rebellion, there was chaos at home, and Cambyses was forced to give up his newly acquired territory to go back and deal with it. But as he was on his way to Persia in the spring of 522 BC, he got gangrene from a small wound on his thigh and died. It was an embarrassing way to go. He was on the throne for less than 10 years. But while he was ruler of Persia, he exercised massive cruelty. For example, there was a Persian judge named Sisamnes who got caught taking a bribe. King Cambyses II decided that to make an example of the corrupt judge, he would flay him alive. The judge was tied to a table, and then a team of expert flayers peeled him like a potato, while Cambyses stood by and watched. Then Sisamnes' flesh was turned into leather, and Cambyses had him sewn into a chair. Number 3. The heretic pharaoh of the New Kingdom. Akhenaten was one of the worst pharaohs in Egyptian history. He ruled from between 1379 and 1336 BC and tried to fundamentally change Egyptian religion. He had the wild idea to bring monotheism into the country, which is the practice of worshipping only a single god. He proclaimed that no longer would the old gods of Egypt be worshipped, but only one, Aten. This may not have been so bad if Akhenaten wouldn't have gone overboard with it. He was obsessed with building as many temples as possible in dedication to Aten. He was so crazy that he announced the construction of a new capital far away from the then current capitals at Thebes and Memphis. He had an entirely new city built in the desert called Amarna and forced at least 20,000 people to move there. But because the city wasn't stable and didn't have access to ample food, death and disease quickly spread through its streets. 2,000 years of tradition was flushed down the toilet by the pharaoh's new religion, and the people were angry. He had the temples of the gods Amun, Mut, and Khonsu dismantled. He killed the priests, and he ordered all references to the gods Amun and Mut erased from Egyptian history. After 17 years of chaos, Akhenaten died. His successor was Nefertiti, who ruled as consort until his son Tutankhamun could take the throne in 1334 BC. Immediately after the deranged pharaoh was gone, Nefertiti started putting things back to the way they used to be. All the silly temples he built were disassembled, and the city of Amarna was abandoned and left a graveyard. Number 2. Pope Alexander VI. Pope Alexander VI is often considered the worst pope in history. The only reason he got the position in the first place was because he bribed enough cardinals that they let him in. The church was so corrupt in the 15th century that anyone with enough money could do pretty much anything. Plus, Alexander was born into the extremely wealthy and influential Borgia family in 1431. Throughout his career as the ruler of the Papal States, which started in 1492, every move he made was to better secure his family's future. He positioned his own family members in prominent places in European royal houses. This was considered an issue to some because the Borgia family was, in essence, the original Italian mafia. The Vatican was ruled by a crime boss. When we look at what Pope Alexander VI did during his reign, we can clearly see he didn't care much about the word of God. He was conniving, political, and promiscuous. History tells us he fathered at least 9 children and frequently hosted kinky parties that even people today would be shocked to see. But the most disturbing thing the Pope did was allegedly engage in a highly inappropriate relationship with his own daughter, Lucretia. Looking back at all the terrible deeds Alexander did, it's pretty easy to see why people didn't have much trust in the Vatican during the Middle Ages. Number 1. Hated Emperor Elegabus. Elegabus was one of the most hated emperors in Roman history. He was born at the beginning of the 3rd century AD and was about as terrible at the job as Nero or Caligula. In his youth, Elegabus served as the high priest of the sun god Elegabus in Syria. His family had been high priests for centuries. His mother happened to be in a good position with the Severan dynasty, which had ruled Rome since 193 AD, And this was how Elegabus was able to get into politics. Following the death of Emperor Macrinus, Elegabus was positioned to take the throne, but he had been a high priest for far too long in a foreign land. Syria was technically part of Rome, but it was considered barbaric to the people who lived within the city of Rome itself. The new emperor refused to wear Roman clothing, he paraded around in his traditional garb, and he continued practicing his priestly duties. That included worshipping a god his subjects had never heard of. There are some accounts that say he practiced human sacrifice, which the Romans found disgusting. But that wasn't all Elegabus was doing. He was lewd, he had multiple romantic partners from both sexes. He was notorious for violating the chastity of noble women and then tossing them aside. His lascivious behavior continued until the year 222 AD. That was when the Praetorian Guard grew so sick of him that they removed the emperor themselves. Which of these awful rulers do you think was the absolute worst? Let me know your thoughts in the comments and remember to hit subscribe. Thanks so much for watching and see you again soon for another crazy video.